Role-playing games first began in 1971. Don't ask me why I know that, because I'm the one who did it. Thank you very much. All my dates are backed up by court documents. Thank you.
The man whom you just saw is the self-proclaimed creator of role-playing in 1971. And this is Gary Gygax, whom many credit as the creator of role-playing games in 1974. And in 1981, it was legally agreed upon that both men are to be credited as co-creators. But there have been debates for quite literally over half a century now. Some say that all the credit belongs to Dave Arneson, while others claim that it was all Gary Gygax's work, and many believe that the answer is somewhere in the middle. So, the question remains, who actually created Dungeons and Dragons? Years ago, in January of 1974, Dungeons and Dragons was released to the world. But our story goes further back in time, all the way back to the 60s. 1967, Gary Gygax is one of the founders of a wargaming club called International Federation of Wargaming. With it, Gary Gygax would also help found the wargaming magazine called International Wargamer, used for releasing wargames and wargaming rules. 1968, Gary Gygax, an avid wargamer who was always writing rule sets, homebrew rules, and even entire games, creates the Geneva Convention, or Gen Con. Dedicated to his wargaming hobby, it proved to be so successful that Gen Con became a yearly event that goes on to this day. At Gen Con, Jeff Perrin plays a game of Siege of Bodenberg, one of the earliest medieval miniature wargames, to which Jeff Perrin creates 4 pages of his own rules for the game, which were what we would today call mass combat rules, which isn't the main focus of Chainmail. Gary Gygax would take these 4 pages and revise, expand, and revise again multiple times over the course of 3 years, making the game Chainmail, which has the names Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin on the cover. But it is arguably a Gary Gygax game. Even Jeff Perrin's own words support this idea.
So to this day, I never played a full game of Chainmail as it was published. I've played in the playtesting, obviously, because they were my rules. But by the time the rules were printed, I had sold off my collection to Gary. So he had the figures all the time, and down in Rockford, we didn't have any more of the medieval ancient types. So several years later, the other rule sets had come along that were, I don't know, more modern, more trendy. So I passed it by. It didn't pass me by.
Okay, so are you still wargaming?
Oh, hell yes.
Okay.
Plus, Jeff Perrin's only other game was Cavaliers and Roundheads, which was also made with Gary Gygax. At the second Gen Con, Gary Gygax meets Dave Arneson, and their mutual interests lead into a friendship soon after. In the same year, David Weasley creates an experimental game called Braunstein, a Napoleonic war game that takes place in the town of the same name. But instead of commanding armies or even small groups of soldiers, players mostly played as non-military individuals. This is the first recorded case of emergent gameplay through role-playing, in a manner very similar to what we still see today in role-playing games. The game had less focus on the combat of warfare and was more focused on the player characters working towards specific goals that would aid in the overall war effort, such as identifying spies. David Weasley will set up 3 more games of Braunstein, but instead of the town of Braunstein, The setting was shifted into an entire fictional country in South America for the remainder of the games. Dave Arneson was a player in Braunstein starting with the second game. 1970. In February, Gary Gygax creates the Castle and Crusade Society, a wargaming group for his friends, specifically focusing on medieval wargames. Some of its first members are Jeff Perrin and Rob Kuntz. 2 months later, in April, Dave Arneson joins the group. Dwayne Jenkins creates his own Braunstein-style game, a Wild West game called Brownstone, taking place in a fictional town of the same name. From game to game, players continued playing as the same characters in a never-ending story with continuity. This is the first recorded instance of what we today recognize as campaign play. Campaign play in war games are very different from campaigns in role-playing games, and Brownstone was very much of the latter. Both Braunstein and Brownstone were still played in the overall style of a war game. There were multiple teams, usually 3 or more, and the players played as either important members of factions or faction leaders instead of forming a party like seen in role-playing games. And there were very clear goals from the very beginning. Once that goal was met, the game would end. 1971. Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin released the game Chainmail through Guidon Games, a small-scale medieval miniatures war game focusing on individuals combat instead of massive groups. That also has included in it a 14-page fantasy supplement, which drew heavy inspiration from the works of Robert Howard's Conan the Barbarian, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné. Just as an example of how much of an impact these people's work had on Gary Gygax, the alignment system that we know in D&D today was created for the fantasy supplement all the way back in Chainmail, directly inspired by Elric of Melniboné. There are hobbits, ents, Nazguls, and Balrogs in the game, and it straight up says that the player should be using Conan-style figures for the miniatures. The fantasy supplement has material in it that is still relevant today in role-playing games, such as elemental dragons, fireball and lightning bolt spells, among many other things ranging from demons to magical weapons. Many mechanics in the game are also very similar to what we would later find in role-playing games, and some straight up still exist, such as morale, spellcasting, and man-to-man melee combat, which today is just normal combat. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, with help from Mike Carr, released the naval war game focusing on single-ship combat by the name of Don't Give Up the Ship through International Wargamer. Gary Gygax has had the concept for Don't Give Up the Ship ever since the first Gen Con, but after meeting Dave Arneson at the second Gen Con and having mutual interest in such a game, they created it together with help from Mike Carr. David Weasley has to leave for the army, leaving referee duties of Braunstein to Dave Arneson. But Dave Arneson doesn't want to develop the game on David Weasley's behalf, so instead he decides to create a new game of his own. In May, a month after Chainmail was released, Dave Arneson began his own campaign using the game of Chainmail, especially the fantasy supplement in it. The fantasy-themed campaign took place in a kingdom called Blackmoor, which is also where the campaign gets its name from. Blackmoor combines many elements from war games Dave Arneson liked: the general rule set, fantasy elements, and small-scale combat of Chainmail, the never-ending story of Brownstone, and the player freedom of Braunstein, and converting wargaming mechanics from Dave Arneson's favorite Napoleonic wargaming rules and naval wargaming rules, most notably the concept of hit points from a naval wargame called Ironclad. Dave Arneson did have some original ideas of his own too, 2 of which are still recognizable today. First is the concept of characters having their own personal traits, which today looks similar to what we know as character attributes. Second is that a large portion of the game takes place in a dungeon filled with hostile people and creatures, which is where dungeon crawling is born from. The campaign was completely based on Dave Arneson's ability to improvise, as Blackmore never had a coherent rule set, not even a written down rule set. Rules were made up on the spot and changed based on the situation, and it wasn't even strictly fantasy themed. There were plenty of sci-fi elements in the campaign, to the point that there are stories of a Star Trek phaser showing up in one of the games. 1972, Dave Megarry, a player of Blackmore, was inspired by his experiences in Blackmore to create the board game Dungeon. While it wouldn't be published until 1975 due to how expensive it would be, the game itself did exist in prototype form. The Dungeon board game is worth a mention as it had dice result tables, specifically for losing in combat against a monster. While the table is directly taken from another board game, the context of how and what it's used for is noteworthy for role-playing games. In November, Dave Megarry shows this prototype to Gary Gygax, whom gets interested in Blackmore. In December, Gary Gygax joins in one of the Blackmore games and is interested in what he sees, but he determines that chainmail is quite unsuitable for this kind of game, even in its modified form, and believes that a whole new game should be created with this kind of play in mind instead. He asks Dave Arneson for his notes, but it takes Dave Arneson about a week to create the 18 pages of mostly handwritten notes. After getting the notes, Gary Gygax determines that they were unusable in the creation of an actual game. So he starts creating a new game from scratch, using the notes as inspiration and focusing on what he found most intriguing about the one game of Blackmore he saw. He is specifically focusing on the aspect of the players being able to buy equipment, gaining experience points, and the game mostly taking place in a dungeon maze, and that the game had a never-ending campaign. To playtest his concepts and design ideas, he starts designing the overall layout of Castle Greyhawk, and begins his own campaign, Greyhawk, which becomes the first Dungeons and Dragons campaign. It took Gary Gygax about 3 weeks to create over 100 typewritten pages of rules for his upcoming Greyhawk campaign, and soon enough, he had almost 300 typewritten pages worth of written rules within a year. 1974. Dungeons and Dragons is released by Gary Gygax's newly created company Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, created for the sole purpose of publishing Dungeons and Dragons the previous year, with the names of Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson on the cover. Funnily enough, the name Dungeons and Dragons comes from one of Gary Gygax's daughters, as they were trying out a bunch of different names that had 2 words starting with the same letter. Ironically enough, Gary Gygax thought that the name was kind of lame at the time. The almost 300 pages of rules Gary Gygax had written were reorganized and separated into 3 little brown booklets. While Dungeons and Dragons could be played as its own game, there were still a lot of rules that required a copy of chainmail to understand, such as initiative and some combat rules, to the point that the original wooden box and later a white cardboard box that the game was released in have an extra space in it specifically for chainmail. This is what we today call Zero Edition, White Box, or simply just Original Dungeons and Dragons, or OD&D for short. OD&D still has mechanics in it that we see today in one form or another. Rolling 3d6 in order to create your character, character classes, attack tables, different weapons doing different types of damage, special ability tables, hit locations, and armor class, among many more mechanics that still exist in role-playing games. The wargaming roots are very visible in OD&D, especially in mechanics like armor class and hit points, which is directly taken from medieval wargames. The 3 booklets even gave us our most iconic role-playing game classes: Fighting Man, today known as the Fighter, Cleric and Magic User, today separated into Wizard, Sorcerer, and Warlock. Players could play as humans, dwarves, elves, and hobbits, which were renamed into halflings after TSR was sued by the Tolkien estate in 1976. In 1975, OD&D would get multiple supplements, which brought in more playable classes. First up is Gary Gygax's own Greyhawk supplement, with help from Rob Kuntz. Greyhawk introduced more iconic classes, namely Paladin and Thief. Today, Thief is known as Rogue. Second up was Dave Arneson's Black Boar, which introduced a subclass to Greyhawk's Thief, the Assassin, which is what rogues resemble a lot more today. The supplement also introduced the Monk class, created by Brian Bloom, simply because he wanted to play as Rebel Williams, the martial artist protagonist from the movie of the same name. There were also some gaming magazines that brought in new classes, but the most famous magazine was easily The Dragon, a monthly magazine about role-playing games in general, not just about D&D. The new classes are Druid, Ranger, Illusionist, Bard, Alchemist, Berserker, and Witch. OD&D was a much bigger success than anyone could had ever imagined, and for the first time, Gary Gygax and his friends didn't need to worry about paying bills and buying food. But one person was unhappy: Dave Arneson. He complained that, quote, the game wasn't right. While it is unknown what Dave Arneson specifically had against OD&D, what is known that he never played OD&D, and that he disagreed with Gary Gygax about what role-playing should be like. The disagreements got so bad that when Dave Arneson was brought in as a creative director at the TSR in early 1976, he either left or was fired by the end of the year. What enraged him further was what happened with Black Boar, to the point where he would publicly let everyone know just how much he despised it. But why would Dave Arneson hate his own work to such a degree? Well, meet Tim Kask.
Most everyone knows you as the first editor for Blackmore.
Oh, yeah.
And then that's what it says in the brochure.
Yeah, I wrote it. Yeah, I started with Blackmore. They gave me a bushel basket full of notes, some handwritten, some in...
Who ultimately had to say what went into the...
Me. From that day forward, it was me that put stuff in. Now, Arneson didn't want to be bothered. He couldn't be bothered to clean up his notes. Here. That's just the way he behaved back then. And I'm not going to knock that guys today, but that's simply the way it was back then. He couldn't be bothered to do it. And so it was my first test. And I made Blackmore. And then he's been very public before he died that he didn't care for it. To which I respond, I don't care. Gary liked it.
You mentioned that Blackmore was the first thing you were actually supposed to editor on. So can you confirm that in contrast that Dave Arneson never made any mistakes? Because that's what I've told by some people. Is that right?
Well, they must be relatives. I'll tell you what I was handed the day I walked into work on a Monday morning. I was handed a peach basket. They're made out of this tall. They're about this tall, and it was full of scraps of paper. Some type. Some handwriting. Different handwritings. Different typewriter. Different papers. Here, this is Blackmore. Oh, really? It took me a week of sorting the notes, trying to figure out which ones pertain to what idea or what concept. Dave was horribly upset with me because I put the Sahagin in there. He thought that every single thing that was going to be in that book would be his, and he didn't give me enough. Not nearly enough. And it required extensive editing, what I would call a heavy edit, which involved rewrite for comprehension, to tie them together. There were a lot of great ideas in there. Dave had a lot of great ideas in the concept and the creation of the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. Dave's strong suit was never application and organization. I don't care what you've heard. I worked with him. If you don't believe me, find an old copy of the first printing of the first fantasy game. That was Dave's compilation of how D&D should have been, and it was 20 to 30% incomprehensible, full of errors, full of typos. All right, it was a vanity book. I think the Judges Guild might have put out the very first one. But look for it under that name, the First Fantasy Game. Find the first edition, first printing, and you'll get a real good idea of how incorrect or mistaken those people are telling you otherwise. I'll simply say that other than the Temple of the Frog, which was purely Dave's, and the only corrections I did were purely editing and, proofreading. The rest of the book is 2/3 stuff that I had to write or rewrite to put all his ideas together in a cogent and coherent fashion. He had a lot of good ideas, but that was just a brainstorm on a napkin type thing, and no development of it. So I had to develop it. I had to rationalize it. So that's how Blackmore came about. That was my maiden voyage, my maiden race, if you will.
Tim Kask is a very important person in the creation and history of D&D, but a long story short, he became lifelong personal friends with Gary Gygax through asking Gary Gygax rules questions about chainmail over the phone. He was the first dungeon master of the second playtester group of D&D after Gary Gygax's own. He was the first hired employee of TSR. He was an editor for OD&D. He was the creator and head editor of the Dragon magazine. He helped Gary Gygax separate the materials that would go into basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's unknown if it was actually him, but he was there in the room when the term role-playing game or RPG was coined. He was the last person to stand by Gary Gygax's side during the Bloom takeover. And even though he had a very important role in the history of D&D, he never bragged about it, and he never tried to make a living out of it. The humility of this man alone gives him a lot of credibility, but he's also able to back up what he says, and it lines up with documented and provable history, so I am willing to put some weight on his words. So, Dave Arneson didn't even write the Blackmore supplement, due to his material being mostly unusable and completely lacking. Dave Arneson would even straight up say as early as 1977 in Different Worlds magazine issue 3 that he didn't write a single word of OD&D. Neither Tim Kask or Gary Gygax changed their story on how D&D, the game itself, was created. While OD&D itself has a short backstory explanation behind the game itself, Gary Gygax would write an article in issue 7 of the Dragon magazine in 1977. In the article, he gives a short summary of how D&D was created, and how he thought that the game wasn't really complete, and was released in a state that it was because everyone who played it outright demanded it to be released because they loved it so much. He also hints that he's working on something new, but more on that later. Even though this is relatively right after Dave Arneson had massive arguments with Gary Gygax and the TSR, and publicly denouncing and complaining about D&D. Gary Gygax doesn't even attempt to change the story on how much involvement Dave Arneson had in D&D. And he never did. Gary Gygax, all the way to his grave, never changed his story. He never denied that Dave Arneson's notes and Blackmore weren't important. He never tries to change the timeline of events, or what got him originally working on Greyhawk and OD&D. And something I personally found quite interesting, he never insults or talks down about Dave Arneson. Even on the EN World forums where he frequently answered fans' questions, when somebody was insulting Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax immediately came to Dave Arneson's defense, while Dave Arneson would do the exact opposite. While Tim Kask would occasionally let his opinion be known on people he disliked, Gary Gygax rarely talks badly about people unless they did something outright evil, like the Bloom family. Part of this, I'm willing to bet, has something to do with Gary Gygax being a Jehovah's Witness. Yes, those Bible-holding people who come knocking at your door to ask if they could talk to you about Jesus. Gary Gygax was one of them, in faith and belief at least, as he didn't do the door-to-door then. But continuing on with 1977, Gary Gygax had announced that he is working on a new Dungeons and Dragons game, and it was going to come out later in autumn. Kind of. You see, he didn't make something like Dungeons and Dragons 2 or call it the second edition, as editions back then were more just minor updates that came with new printings of games. Gary Gygax wanted to make something new, and to also finish his true vision of Dungeons and Dragons, as he viewed OD&D as somewhat unfinished, but now, 3 years later, the game had grown both in size and as a game. And Gary Gygax has been able to analyze the game and was now focused on harnessing the true potential of it. Problem is, the game got big, way too big, to the point where it was straight up so massive that it had to be split into multiple books. OD&D was also split into multiple different booklets, not books, as the OD&D booklets are US standard letter paper folded over, making them half the size of a letter, while what becomes the AD&D books are a full B5 size books, which is tiny bit smaller than US standard letter size. But just how big did the game get? Well, it was big enough that it took 3 years to actually fully release the game. Keyword, fully. 1977 is the year always given to this new D&D game, because it started being released as it was split in two. You see, there was so much material that not only would it take years to make into a game, but some of it had to be cut out and some split into a different product. Gary Gygax with Tim Kask split the material that would go into what we today know as the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons, or just D&D Basic, and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. D&D Basic was edited by Eric Holmes, but the game itself was created by Gary Gygax. And D&D Basic was, well, just that. It was a basic version of AD&D, literally. It wasn't its own game. It was like a tutorial version of AD&D. This seems quite odd today, but it still exists. We still have stripped down starter sets of RPGs that serve as tutorials to get people into a game system. A pretty innovative idea for the time, as D&D Basic Set was a box set that came with the blue game book, some dice and other game material. Problem is, the game was a glorified tutorial for AD&D, which wouldn't exist for years in full. The same year, in December of 1977, AD&D Monster Manual was released. Next up, in June of 1978. Half a year after the Monster Manual was released, the AD&D Player's Handbook was released. But you would have a difficult time trying to actually play it, because some important rules needed to play the game were only in the Dungeons Master's Guide. AD&D wasn't structured like how modern games are, with Game Master only material in the Game Master's book. I am personally unaware why this was done this way, and it wasn't for money reasons. We know that the game genuinely wasn't finished. The material existed, but you had to actually write it into an actual game using a typewriter, and then playtest it and revise it. But it doesn't explain why certain material was only in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And to my knowledge, no RPG has ever done that again. But that's all I'm going to cover about AD&D, mostly because I could make 3 big videos just about AD&D. Almost all D&D mechanics you see today find their origins in AD&D. The game had been expanded immensely in a way that allowed for dozens of different kinds of campaigns. And as AD&D still wore its wargaming origins on its sleeves, it has optional complexity and scalability that made AD&D the RPG, to the point that it's very much a valid RPG of choice even today. I would argue that the most important part about AD&D is Gary Gygax's RPG philosophy. Gary Gygax was very much into immersive and dynamic play, and hated rules lawyers. Gary Gygax literally says numerous times, most notably in the afterword of the Dungeon Master's Guide, that you are supposed to follow the spirit of the rules and not play rules as written like a lawyer. And he would keep saying this to his grave. There isn't a single point in time when he is outright commanding you to play rules as written, but to take the game in your direction with your own style. And before anyone asks, AD&D is known as First Edition because of the advanced name, as AD&D is a completely new game that is vastly different from OD&D, and there is the basic product line to ease people into the game. AD&D is what we today would call a full reboot that has very little to do with its predecessor. But there is one more event I have to cover, and some of you may already know what it is. In February in 1979, Dave Arneson sues Gary Gygax and TSR. A big lawsuit that lasted until March of 1981. But why? Money. Specifically, royalties. This is a legal document from the District Court of Minnesota about the 2-year-long legal battle. And while I sadly lack the legal expertise to properly analyze the legal document and go through the entire 189-page document in detail, I can give you a basic understanding of what happened and why. In short, Dave Arneson sued Gary Gygax and the TSR because he wasn't paid royalties for the AD&D books. Some of you might be quite confused right now. You see, Gary Gygax gave co-authorship to people on products if he deemed their involvement to be important enough for the creation of the game, regardless of what their input in its creation actually was. As we have seen it with J-Mail and OD&D, and the co-authors get the same royalties that he also gets, which is a percentage of the price the book is sold at. Dave Arneson's legal agreement for OD&D, for example, shows that he was being paid 10% for every game sold. The legal agreement being made in April of 1975, most likely as the Blackmore supplement was being made for OD&D, which was later amended when TSR purchased all assets in the partnership half a year later in September. Dave Arneson also claimed that he wasn't being paid his royalties on D&D Basic, but TSR proved in court that yes, he was being paid 5% royalties for the game. Keyword, game. Not the entire box set, just a blue game book inside the box, which was also being sold separately. TSR argued that Dave Arneson wasn't entitled to royalties for things outside his legal agreement, like the other things in the box, the dice set, the dungeon geomorph set, and the monster and treasure assortment set. And it is a fair argument, as game authors in general don't get paid for the other stuff in the box, so it's unlikely that Gary Gygax was paid for those either. And while there is a whole debate on if Dave Arneson actually deserved royalties for D&D Basic, the game is still similar enough to OD&D that you can make an argument that it's not different enough from OD&D for Dave Arneson to not get royalties from it. But what about AD&D? Well, Dave Arneson argued that the old legal agreement for OD&D entitled him to royalties for AD&D as well, because it used the D&D name, specifically demanding 5% on all D&D products, including AD&D, even though Gary Gygax was only being paid 2.5%. Dave Arneson also claimed that the removal of his name from the game boxes and books caused him permanent damage to, and I quote, his reputation as a professional author of games and game rules, to which he demanded a payment of over $50,000 for damages. $50,000 is today $250,000 after calculating for inflation. Why would he sue royalties for a game that he has absolutely nothing to do with? It is at the same time very simple and very dumb. The name. Despite TSR proving in court that not only did AD&D begin development after Dave Arneson left TSR, but they also had 7 witnesses, of whom only some were employees of TSR, who were also able to testify to this. The big problem was still the usage of the name Dungeons and Dragons. What does the name Advanced Dungeons and Dragons make you think? Especially when D&D Basic and OD&D exist. Just that it's an expert version of the game, right? Instead of a sequel so big and different that there is very little mechanically speaking you can directly point to OD&D and say it was copy-pasted instead of completely redesigned. And remember, this is 1979. D&D is literally the world's first RPG, and the term RPG wasn't coined until after the Dungeon Master's Guide was released. Not only was D&D as a whole a first of its kind, AD&D was also very much a first of its kind. Today we understand that a new edition is a whole new game. Back then, board games and war games editions were just minor revisions done in new printings. So it was still the same game. And because AD&D collects, updates, and reworks all officially released D&D material to that point to a certain extent, many thought that the game was just a big updated compilation instead of a whole new game. That combined with the general ineptitude of the US legal system, it is no wonder that the lawsuit happened the way it did. Through the lawsuit, it becomes clear that the name was the only thing Dave Arneson cared about. Remember how he denounced OD&D and its Blackboard supplement? Even in interviews later in his life, it's obvious that he doesn't care about D&D. The biggest thing he cares about is being known as the creator of role-playing, not role-playing games. Specifically, role-playing. This really gives some contrast on how the two men were liked. Gary Gygax in June of 1979, 4 months after Dave Arneson's lawsuit began. He is praising the man, and he was like this to his grave. The man barely held grudges, except maybe just against the Blooms, but that's a story for another time. While Dave Arneson, well, he couldn't deny that he used chainmail for Blackmore, he would always downplay how important it was for Blackmore, even on the OD&D 74 forums here in December of 2008, almost a year after Gary Gygax died in March 2008, and 4 months before Dave Arneson himself would join him in the afterlife. Dave Arneson would never make a game of his own. He only co-authored on one RPG after D&D. That went absolutely nowhere, and its other co-author went to solo author RPGs. But here he is, demanding his name on a game he publicly hates, made by people he hates, just because he gets royalties from them and D&D as a whole was exploding. Not to mention the outcome. Unlike what some people claim, he didn't actually win the lawsuit. The lawsuit was settled out of court in March of 1981, 2 years after the lawsuit began. While very little of it is known on what happened, what we do know is that Dave Arneson was paid a cash sum and 2.5% royalties on AD&D books, and his name would be in the reprinted 3-core AD&D books, but not on the cover, or on the other AD&D books that came out later, like Unearthed Arcana in 1985. So it's possible that he only got royalties on the 3 main books of AD&D and nothing else. But there was also another lawsuit in 1984, because he demanded royalties for Monster Manual 2, which is a confusing case in of itself, as it literally has the number 2 on it, a clear statement of a sequel. But Dave Arneson sued and argued that it was nothing more than a revision of the AD&D Monster Manual, which just isn't the case. But in the end, he got royalties for that as well. And his total yearly royalties could go as high as $1.2 million. And that is where our story ends. And the reason why, legally speaking, Dave Arneson is the co-creator of D&D. But, as you might have noticed, he had very little to actually do with the creation of D&D. He very much was one of the people who created role-playing in a modified wargame, but role-playing games are a different thing. And Gary Gygax, beyond the shadow of a doubt, created those. But it still doesn't mean that Gary Gygax is Jesus and Dave Arneson is Judas. Even people like Tim Kask have said and argued that because of how vast and close these friend circles and wargame groups were, role-playing would have been born in one way or another, and some game would have taken the place of Dungeons and Dragons, as everyone there influenced each other, everyone shared rules with each other, and everyone played together. With how innovative this time and these people were, it is a fair argument to make, along with the thought experiment of what might have happened if certain people simply weren't present. But before people start any kind of a censorious campaigns of removing Dave Arneson's name from everything involving Dungeons and Dragons, it would be intellectually dishonest to say that Dave Arneson had no part in the creation of role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons. He was the source of inspiration, and without a spark, a fire cannot be lit. And Dungeons and Dragons is truly inspired. It has everything from Conan the Barbarian, The Lord of the Rings, Elric of Melniboné, and medieval history and culture. Nothing is born in a vacuum. Everything takes inspiration from something. Like how Star Wars was born from inspiration from Flash Gordon, Japanese samurai films, and the Second World War, among other things. While I personally disagree that Dave Arneson should be given co-creator credit on a game he arguably had nothing to do with, as I value the actual creative work itself rather than the inspirations of that work. But, you know who always said that Dave Arneson was a key inspiration in the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, to the point that the game wouldn't exist without him? All the way to his grave? Gary Gygax. Even after the lawsuit, even after the company and the game were stolen from him, even after his game was turned to shit, even after everything that happened to him and to D&D, he actually managed to repair his relationship with Dave Arneson later in his life, and he never denied Dave Arneson's role in D&D. And in this case, the creator's word is all that actually matters. Wouldn't you agree? My final point is that while Dave Arneson only has 2 RPGs with his name on them, and his involvement in their creation can be questionable at best, Gary Gygax not only made, but published many games before, during, and after OD&D, and continued to work on games until his death. This is a really good example of the difference and what it truly means to be a game designer versus being an idea guy.